Today I wanted to talk about the labour market and government policy. You're all aware that Australia is now in recession, and the biggest tragedy about the recessions is the impact it has on the labour market. So if we look at the last few recessions in the early 1980s, it took 6 years to get the unemployment rate back to the level that it enjoyed before the recession of that period. In the early 1990s, it took 15 years to get back to that pre-recession level of unemployment. Even in the GFC, that wasn't technically identified as a recession, 12 years after the GFC, the unemployment rate was still not back at that 4% low that we saw before the advent of the GFC. So what about this current recession? Well, we've recently been told by the Bureau of Statistics that the unemployment rate is now 7.1%. That's the highest level that we've seen since 2001. But bear in mind that that number would have been a lot higher. Over the April-May period, we lost 835,000 jobs, but 626,000 workers left the workforce, partly because they felt discouraged about prospects of getting a job, partly because due to the lockup it was very difficult for them to seek work anyway. So without that big reduction in the number of people in the workforce, the unemployment rate actually would have been 11.3%. Then we need to add to that the fact that 360,000 workers registered as being employed, even though they didn't work any hours at all. And adding to that, 1.2 million workers that registered as being employed but had their hours cut significantly. So that's another 1.5 million workers, which is about 11% of the workforce. And of course, that second effect is very much due to the JobKeeper package, where workers have been able to remain attached to their jobs, even though they are not working many hours at all. All of that adds up to the fact that we've seen that hours worked in April and May are down by around 10%. And that's why we're expecting to see around a 7% contraction in the economy in that June quarter, that April, May, June period, mainly because of this big contraction in hours worked. So what are the prospects for the unemployment rate going forward? Well, we expect that it'll peak at 8.6% in August. And then, of course, government policy will come into play in terms of how the government deals with the scheduled unwinding of JobKeeper and JobSeeker. With regard to JobKeeper, I believe that there are at least 1 million workers who are involved in firms that will continue to be affected by coronavirus policies. That's particularly around international travel and social distancing. So I think the government has to give serious consideration to extending the support through JobKeeper for those workers and those industries. As far as JobSeeker is concerned, that's the payment to people who are unemployed. That was lifted from around $560 a fortnight to $1,115 a fortnight back in March. Now that $1,115 isn't that far away from the minimum wage of $1,500 a fortnight. So when the government decides how to adjust JobSeeker, it's going to need to make a decision around that balance between maintaining a living wage, and of course it's extraordinarily unlikely that they'd push the rate back to that $565. But of course that $11.15 looks pretty close to the minimum wage, and therefore there'll be issues about incentivising people to look for work and issues around employers being incentivised to employ at those sorts of levels. So getting that balance right is going to be a very important decision from the government. Finally, we have to think about the budget that's coming up in October. What we have to bear in mind there is that over the 2019, private final demand was totally flat. So we saw no growth in private spending over that period. So the economy was very weak even going into the coronavirus crisis. The government needs to address that issue. In my opinion, the emphasis needs to be on boosting household incomes. I would like to see personal tax cuts come back onto the agenda. And For a start, I'd like to see the personal tax cuts that have been already legislated to begin in July 2022 to be brought forward to shortly after the introduction of the October budget. Even with all of those initiatives, we still unfortunately expect that the unemployment rate will still be around 8% by the end of this year and only down to 7% by the end of next year. They are still very high numbers and well above the 5% that the economy enjoyed before the corona crisis. But we have to bear in mind we have to work very hard so that we don't end up with the problems we've seen in the aftermath of previous recessions. Thank you.